everyone. Welcome to another Mountain States of Mind webinar. I'm Sean Page. I'm the Communications Director here at Mountain States Legal Foundation in Denver, Colorado. I think we have a great program for you today on a very hot topic based on the response we've gotten. Today's topic is going to be who pays the price for rewilding the West? And as a subhead is, what can Colorado expect as we head down this rewilding road after voters narrowly approved a ballot measure in 2020 to put us on that road? Mountain States Legal Foundation, if you're not familiar with us, please go to our website, mslegal.org. We're celebrating 45 years this year. That's a lot of staying power. We fight for your constitutional rights across the board. Sometimes that's gun rights. Sometimes that's property rights. Sometimes your equal protection rights. So we work a lot in the space. We work a lot in public lands issues and endangered species issues. So that's why we have a passion and an interest in this particular topic today. Let me just explain the format today. We do it very simply. I've got an excellent panel joining us today, and we'll have a panel discussion for the first, I'd say, 30 minutes just amongst ourselves. Got a lot of ground to cover this morning. And then we'll open it up to your questions. There is a question toggle at the bottom of your screen. You don't have to wait to the Q&A. If along the way you have questions that you want to ask, please go ahead and fill those in. I'll get a chance to see those, and then I'll redirect them to who the logical person is to answer those questions. I want to thank everybody for joining us, our guests as well as our audience. Let me briefly introduce the panel today, just to let everyone know. Ken Holsinger is with us. He's a lawyer, and he has a firm, Holsinger LLC, here in Denver, Colorado. His legal work, he does legal work on public lands, endangered species, energy, water issues, and he's widely recognized as top-notch in that field. He also sits on in the interest of full disclosure, he also sits on our board, and we're delighted to have him on there. Also joining us from Wyoming is Jim Magagna. He is the Executive Vice President at the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. We've also done business with Jim over the years and probably still have ongoing businesses with cases because we do have clients in Wyoming who are dealing firsthand on a daily basis with both wolves and grizzlies. Beaming in from Montana is George Edwards. He's the Executive Director of the Montana Livestock Loss Board. I recently met George when I made a call to get some data, to check on some data about predation numbers over the years, and it was amazing. I reached a human being. He actually knew what he was talking about, and he was willing to share that information. So it was great. And I thought we have to have George on. He's very knowledgeable. Also joining us from way out west is Todd Nash. He's the Wallowa County Commissioner. Did I get that right? Wallowa? Okay. County Commissioner in Oregon, and he's also the president of the Oregon Cattlemen's Association. Finally, Terry Frankhauser. He's the Executive Vice President and Colorado Cattlemen's Association. So he's going to be able to tell us, update us on a lot on what the state of play is here in Colorado. What I see when I look out at the rewilding of the West is total chaos and confusion at this point. It's just kind of crazy. Wolves not long ago were totally removed from the list. Now they're on in some states, not on in others. Grizzlies qualified to be delisted years ago, according to the science and according to the law, according to all the original benchmarks of the repopulating of grizzlies. Yet there's consistent resistance to removing them from the list. The governors of Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and I'm not sure who else have tried to petition Washington to intervene and get something done about removing these animals from the endangered species list so states can have a firmer hand in managing these animals. But whether those pleas for help from this administration have fallen on deaf ears so far. The rules of engagement and predation compensation programs vary from state to state. It's kind of a crazy quilt of things that are going on out there, and even within the states. And I know Todd will want to talk about this in Oregon. There seems to be sometimes a bait and switch that's going on where you're initially promised one thing in terms of compensation or how to deal with problem packs. Later on, you find out that those rules don't really apply. So the rules are constantly changing. The goalposts are constantly moving. And now we have a new twist here in Colorado, which is voter-approved rewilding or reintroduction programs. That's new. We always have to keep in mind that all this stuff was basically forced on the states using the Endangered Species Act as a cudgel, and both the grizzly expansion and the wolf rewilding were done against the wishes of these states. So that's where we are today. So there's a lot of craziness and chaos, but maybe we can make some sense of it today. Let me start out by talking to Kent Holsinger, and then Jim McGagnon. I think you'd be in a good position. Give people the 30,000 foot look at where we are and kind of how it's been going on for 25, 30 years, if you look at the whole picture. But where are we today? How did we get here? And again, what can people who are running ranching operations and live in the rural parts of these states, what are they living with, and what can they expect under the current sort of regimes that they have in these states?
You bet. Thanks, Sean. This issue hits really close to home. I come from a ranching family in North Park, where Colorado had its first confirmed wolf kills for the first time in over 70 years. And I remember reading the history of my home county. The last wolf pack there was in the 1940s, and the devastation, the rugged distance they crossed was just unbelievable. And sure enough, thanks to the urban voters in Colorado, we have nothing but more of that upcoming. And the procedural history is unbelievably complex. These issues have been going on since the early 1990s with endangered status and the like. I'm going to start at 2020, when the Trump administration delisted wolves in the lower 48 period. Recovery numbers were far in excess of what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said would ever be required, and yet there's been continual blowback, continual litigation. But in 2020, there was a delisting. Not surprisingly, the usual suspect environmental groups filed suit. They found a judge in the Northern District of California in February of this year to say, no, wolves should be listed as endangered in the lower 48, but outside of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. So we're looking at the Southern Rockies and the Great Lakes, where we have gray wolves that are listed as federally endangered. And down south, we have Mexican wolves that are also listed as federally endangered. And Colorado sits right smack in the middle of the range, probably the very fringes of the range for both species.
So why is it that some of the states, you mentioned there was a relisting, but some of the states don't have relisting? And then I guess the next question would be, is where are the wolves that are coming to Colorado? Where do they fit into this giant puzzle?
Well, I'll answer the second question. Unquestionably, they are listed as endangered. The wolves that have migrated to Colorado are federally listed. But I'll defer to Jim on the whole history of the Northern Rockies, what they call Distinct Population Segment, or DPS.
Go ahead, Jim. Do you want to take that cue and talk a little bit? We're moving north now into Wyoming. What's the situation up there?
Well, perhaps just very briefly, a little bit of background. I've actually been engaged on this issue since 1984, when I was asked to serve on a task force put together by the Secretary of Interior to come up with a plan for reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone National Park. we developed a diverse group, a plan that would have only protected wolves within the boundaries of the park. Unfortunately, that was dead on arrival in Washington, D.C. So we moved forward to when the secretary introduced wolves into Yellowstone. Our approach in Wyoming has been kind of based on that earlier experience, that we've only agreed to protection of wolves within the area that was defined by the Fish and Wildlife Service as the essential area in order to maintain a recovered population. We've committed to that. Our industry made some real sacrifices, but we committed to that. But one of the things that we feel has worked well is that in Wyoming, outside of that area in northwestern Wyoming, the wolf is a predator, just like a coyote or any other species, can be taken by anyone, anytime, by any legal hunting or trapping method. And so,
go ahead, Jim.
well,
Sorry.
just back to the DPS issue. So the area that was defined for the DPS was included a part of our state, yet we've been challenged. Wolves were delisted, relisted based on litigation twice, delisted, and now again, while we're not a part of that decision on that was recently handed down by the Northern District of California, there was a petition recently filed with Fish and Wildlife to consider a relisting in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. The Wildlife Service did, or Fish and Wildlife, their mandatory 90-day finding, and they've actually concluded, incredibly, that there is reason to proceed with a 12-month finding as to whether the species should be relisted in our 3 states.
It's very complex. So, I mean, you're paid to stay on top of this stuff, Jim, but for the average rancher or farmer or this must be baffling. I mean, how do they stay on top of it? I guess with the help of your organization. I'd also talk a little bit about grizzlies, because it's not as easy to remove a grizzly as a wolf. We found that out with some of our clients in the Upper Green River.
Well, that is certainly true. And one of the interesting facts to keep in mind is when I'm using an example of the group that you deal with in the Upper Green River, which is a coalition of about 9 different ranchers that run their cattle together up on the National Forest in the summer. Prior to the introduction of wolves, their typical summer losses ranged about 3% from all causes. Within 5 years after the wolves coming in, that 3% became 7 to 9%. Then the grizzly bears migrated into that area, and it's now become 12 to 14%. I believe as high as 17 one year. The one interesting thing is that wolf depredation of cattle has declined significantly as the grizzly bears have established themselves as the more lethal and more dominant species over the wolves in that area.
And there's quite a process in terms of identifying. There's a predation compensation program, but one of the things I learned in a visit or two up there was, boy, there's a process in getting that confirmed and going through that process. Could you talk a little about what happens when a rancher loses some livestock to a grizzly bear up in the Upper Green?
Certainly. The compensation program is administered by our Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Compensation actually comes out of sportsman dollars for purchasing hunting licenses. And so a kill has to be confirmed by a representative of the Game and Fish. And they actually, in that part of the state, have one individual. That's their sole responsibility during the summer months when the cattle are up in that high country, is to be available on call to go confirm these kills. And that's a necessary first step. Do you want me, I don't know, Sean, do you want me to go into the compensation program itself at this point, or?
Well, you could broad brush it, Jim. Just kind of, how does it work? And is it fair?
Established in Wyoming, losses are compensated based on their value at the end of the season. So a calf is compensated not based on what it might have been worth on the day it was killed, but what it would have been worth assumed it had survived until market time. So that's that part of it. Through some work that was done in Wyoming as well as some in Montana, we were able to establish some compensation formulas, realizing that not all of the animals killed are found. So in Wyoming's case, with wolves, adult cattle are compensated 1-to-1, just the animal that's found. Right now, we're in the process of making a slight tweak there for yearling cattle that will provide about a 1.25 compensation, realizing that they're just a little harder to find because they travel more than a cow with a calf. And then on calves, the compensation for wolves is 7-to-1. So you get paid for 7 calves based on market value for every one that is identified. For sheep, that's the case for all sheep. Both adult and lambs are 7-to-1. Then with the grizzly bears, we've moved on, and that's a different formula based on some experience and studies done there. For grizzly bears, it's 3.5-to-1 for calves and sheep. But that's the compensation formula. But as you mentioned earlier, Sean, I think this is so key that's only compensation for a dead animal. Our ranchers who have operated in these areas now for 20 years, in the case of the wolves, can point to smaller weight gains on their livestock because they're being disturbed by the wolves up there. They can point in many cases to lower rates of reproduction because the animals are being disturbed at the time when they're in breeding season up there as well. And the other one that even the environmental community who so supports these animals doesn't always take into consideration, because the wolves and the grizzly bears cause our livestock to move around, to gather up more, get in one corner and then another corner, that negative impact on the rangeland resource itself.
Interesting. Let's bring it back to Terry Frankhauser here in Colorado. You've been following the process since voters did this. As Kent pointed out, most of the voters who approved of this were from more urban areas along the Front Range. Some other outliers like Pitkin County, where Aspen is and where the rich elites live, also voted for it. But do you think, is your sense that folks who are putting together this effort in Colorado are paying attention to what is happening in other states and learning the lessons?
That's a good question. We're only privy to a portion of the process. There's 2 major groups that have been commissioned by our game management agency. One is more of a stakeholders group and the other is more of a technical group. The stakeholder group is completely open to the public, has the ability for feedback and comment, albeit limited, in verbal form, but in written form, unlimited. The technical group is held in confidence, but they do have written reports that are released. That technical group has representatives on it from Wyoming, from Montana, primarily either with the game management agencies at the state level or Fish and Wildlife Service. We also have other federal agencies on there like Wildlife Services, state agencies, people that run different programs that deal with predators, things along those lines. So, assuming that you would set everybody's, personal beliefs, as well as, frankly, to some extent, asking another state or another agency to sort of deal with Colorado's voter developed issue. The makeup is fairly reasonable. I think a lot of people are unhappy. Everybody's pretty unhappy with the makeup. So that means it's probably about as good as you could do. Right. They're moving incrementally, albeit there's a huge level of complication that comes in with a federal listing through the court of these wolves, because it's one thing to have a delisted species where the state is in full authority related to a reintroduction. It's another thing when you have to have a complicit federal agency that essentially then has the oversight. So it's the process is moving, but the process is about to get infinitesimally more complicated because of the federal element.
Yeah, and there was a story the other day, for instance. There's been some fairly good reporting on this by Colorado media, but a story the other day indicating, okay, the big devilish question is, where do we release these animals? In what parts of the state will they be released? The other question would be, so how's it shaping up in terms of who pays? I mean, these sums will go up as more predation occurs. Assuming so, what's the thinking on where that money will come from, Terry?
One would preclude that if you win the ballot initiative and there's going to be wolves in Colorado and the state's going to have to pay for it, why would you care if you're a wolf proponent what gets paid for? And that wasn't the case in the beginning. I think there's been some learning on behalf of wolf proponents that that's probably the safer place for them to be, is to say, let's entertain fairly liberal compensation, if you will. And that's where they've arrived at least in general agreement. Wasn't 100% of the stakeholders group or the technical groups that agreed to their compensation strategy that was advanced to our Wildlife Commission, which is ultimately the decision-making authority. But in general, they agreed to, similar to what Wyoming has, 7 times replicator. In fact, I think, Jim, it mimics Montana's related to the age of the animals and things along those lines. There's some holes in it. It doesn't cover some animals the way that it should. But they went on to say that also they would entertain indirect losses, or what is being referred to as production losses, those being those gestational issues, the reproductive issues, weight loss, even range. Interestingly, range is harder for them to grasp, I think, and over time we would find some sense of that. But there's an allowance to go either through the multiplier or the verified route in what is being referred to Parks and Wildlife. And for us, that's important. We pushed very, very diligently on this indirect loss piece, because we think that actually at the end of the day, the losses in reproduction, these are flight animals, right? They are both, without even being introduced to a prey-based, a predator, they have an inherent knowledge and of them. And once they've been introduced to them, in the case of northern Colorado or any of the other areas that have wolves, those cattle become, in many ways, very difficult to manage, and they do have production losses. So we pushed very aggressively on that. We even talked about pay for presence, which was too complicated for this day and age. That's a European model that gets used, and it was probably too confusing for us to deal in. But the compensation aspect, we made headway on. Who pays? Well, it's the citizens of Colorado. It has to be a General Assembly or a non-license, hunting license orientated pot of money. So Parks and Wildlife has a pot of those dollars that are non-license orientated, but it's limited. And the General Assembly has a pot of money. Of course, that's limited based on Colorado's budget year and the ability to appropriate money. I'll give you an example. Here's one of the complications. Just because now Colorado will have to enter into a NEPA-based approach and do an EIS, or an environmental impact statement, for reintroduction, the Fish and Wildlife Service said that's on Colorado to pay for, and that's $1 million bill.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So
yeah, and we're getting into some acronyms now that some listeners may not know, NEPA and all the other things that the hoops that you have to jump through. Kent, I know that's an area that you want to jump in real quick and explain and succinctly how this all works?
Sure. So like Terry said, it's a different world now that there's a federal listing. And that means there are a whole slew of compliance requirements, permitting requirements under the Endangered Species Act, and likely under what's called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And to give you just an idea, one of our water providers here in Colorado has been working on a reservoir project. They're at year 16 in their EIS, and they are nearing completion. And the going rate as of a year or two ago on NEPA compliance for projects like that is roughly $2 million a year. So, we would expect to see if anyone were to propose a reservoir project as an example, Section 7 consultations with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and EIS under NEPA, and years of red tape and millions of dollars.
Do you think, Terry, and we'll switch over to some other states now, that one, things are moving too fast in Colorado, and two, what kind of attitude are you getting from leadership here? Governor Jared Polis is supposedly an animal lover. His husband is a vegan or vegetarian animal lover. And there's this sense sometimes you get in Colorado, some of it predates Polis, but that the concerns of rural Colorado really just don't matter to where the power elite in this state live, which is along the populated front range in places like Boulder. And to them, wolves are these magical creatures out in the woods. So one, is Colorado moving too fast? Is there a way to slow the process down at this point, or is it a runaway train? And two, what kind of attitude or support or help or concern are you getting from the governors? I know there's a lot of questions, but.
I mean, let's start with the fact that there's a deadline in the ballot initiative 114. That's a statutory piece. It's statutory, so it could be changed. That says by the end of 2023, there has to be a plan in place that would facilitate introduction of wolves. The governor came out early on and said, way too long. I want it done in a year. Of course, that was a political maneuver as it relates to this whole listing minutia that was going on. And this goes back to the Trump era delisting of wolves and along those lines. So where do we find ourselves today? That deadline still exists. I think Kent pointed out by nature of experience, I think probably through multiple occasions, all the best hopes and wishes in place, but a complicated NEPA process to achieve that in a year or so. Now, mind you, we've got a lot of work to do before we can even work at proposing something with Fish and Wildlife Service. Say it's a Colorado Fish and Wildlife Service sort of proposal. There is so much that has to be done, but then what about litigation? What about public comment? What about all of those things? So I think as much as the governor and some local fish and wildlife folks will say, we're going to meet the deadline, I think that's more marketing than it is reality. And I would be surprised if that deadline gets met. And in fact, it could be that we reestablish wolves naturally in Colorado before we ever introduce a wolf. Who knows?
And that's an interesting point. What non-Coloradans might not realize, we have started having predations here, but those are wolves that have gradually migrated naturally into the state, up in the far northwest, I guess, part of the state. Let's go to George Edwards. We talked earlier about compensation. Now, the Montana Livestock Loss Board, that is your job. And could you talk a little bit about the trajectory of that over time, how that's taken shape? I know private animal groups initially said they paid this compensation, but it's been taken over. Is it now all done by taxpayers, or how has that evolved there?
Well, I'd like to start out actually addressing another question first, and then I will go to that.
Okay.
In Montana, Idaho, and part of Wyoming, there was a congressional delisting of wolves, and it said it is not open to a legal challenge. And so when you guys were having the big discussion about the national relisting of wolves, there's a carve out for the states up in my area. But when I go to the compensation and directly to your question, our governor back 20 years ago, created a wolf advisory group. It's similar to the process going on in Colorado right now. And they worked up until 2007 and created the laws that regulate our board. Our compensation is based on general fund taxpayer dollars. And so it's income tax in our state that covers the losses. Our program was originally not funded at all. We went the first 2 years on a donation piece because, as you said earlier, many of these groups said, yes, they would put money into a trust fund that would operate our board and allow for the compensation. To date, not a single dime has ever been offered up to be put into that trust fund. So the things that were discussed by that Wolf Advisory Council to fund our board never happened. It was empty promises. We ended up going to our state legislature through the Montana Wool Growers, who has been a great support in our state, to seek those general fund tax dollars, and we were allotted $200,000 per year. And that was great. We operated on that, and along with the delisting of wolves, we were able to stay within those boundaries. Prior to the delisting, we were on a very fast upward trajectory for losses. And at one point, we were even giving out IOUs to ranchers saying, when we can find money to pay you, we will get you paid.
Really?
But that $200,000 was adequate to cover until 2017. Grizzly bear loss was added to our board, and we were still okay, but the trajectory of the grizzly bear loss, because they are still threatened species in our state, has just skyrocketed. In fact, in calendar year 2021, we are at $345,000 in payouts, and that is without paying a multiplier. In 2017, our state tax dollar allotment was increased to $300,000. So we are now exceeding that as well. So you can see a trajectory on these endangered or threatened species that can escalate very, very fast. There were other speakers that spoke about the multiplier. The multiplier has been a goal of our board from day one, because we do recognize everything that everybody else has commented on. They're real. The problem we have is there is not the will of our state legislature to add additional money in order to pay that multiplier at this time. So in Montana, it is just direct verified losses. All of our losses are verified by USDA Wildlife Services. They're looked at as a neutral third party, because if you have a game and fish agency that is responsible for protecting the wolves and also doing the investigations, there's, I don't know how, a good way to say it is a distrust. And so thankfully, some rural legislators in our state, when they created our laws, says USDA Wildlife Services has the sole discretion. And that made them the neutral third party, because they don't gain if wolves are added or if they're taken away. We pay compensation based on fall weaning weights. So if a day-old calf was killed today, we would use today's values through the USDA market reports for Montana to pay what that rancher would have received in the fall. And it's based on sales within the past year. So a rancher knows what their winning weights were in the prior year.
Mm-hmm.
Weight loss is a huge thing, though. And I can't stress enough, we want to pay a multiplier. We just have not been able to fund one.
Okay. Let me jump over to Todd Nash out in Oregon real quick. Todd, you came to my attention. I was reading an article in one of the Oregon papers on this issue. And by the way, just to interrupt myself, the Q&A is coming up here very shortly. So go ahead and you can send your questions via the little toggle down at the bottom, and we'll get to those momentarily. I know there are a lot of good ones. But Todd, you came to my attention because there was a quote in an article, and it kind of goes to this bait and switch. You know, when wolves were not brought, but they migrated into Oregon, there was this assumption or a promise that compensation would be paid. But it looks like games are being played a little bit with that in Oregon. Can you fill us in on the history there and what's going on from your point of view?
Yeah, well, most recently, we asked for $1 million to fill in for compensation. In Oregon, 30% of the compensation needs to be dedicated to non-lethal funds. And so those non-lethal deterrents, either the rancher can do them or you can hire somebody. Sometimes the counties are hiring individuals to do non-lethal activities. We have been using about 70 to 80% of our funds to do non-lethal here in Oregon. And you would think that that would be touchy-feely enough, but we have been uprooted every time. And some of those same players that have engaged in the lawsuit that got us relisted again, Defenders of Wildlife, who acted like they want to be our friends, and others, they line up to keep us from getting that money. And our legislature, much like Montana's, it sounds like, doesn't have a taste for that at this time. And so we were derailed there. We've been derailed several times in adequately funding that. Back in 2011, 2012, we established the compensation program, but it's never been adequately funded. We do have a program here for above normal loss and missing livestock. And a lot of times those ranchers are only getting funded at a rate of 12% and less. And so we've seen over time, many of our ranchers just not buy into the system anymore, whether it's trying to get confirmation from what George described as an agency that is conscribed with the conservation of the species. And then they're also the ones that have to make the investigation that could lead toward a lethal take in some cases. There is a conflict there. It's a direct conflict. And we feel like Wildlife Services is that best balance there too. Wildlife Services has been told that they have to go through training from Oregon Fish and Wildlife in order to be adequately trained in this. And it's pretty funny when you have somebody that does investigations their entire lives, and now they're trained politically by a state agency that frankly, a lot of them don't know their way around an investigation.
The rules of engagement, we're talking a lot about compensation, and not factored in there is all the money that gets spent at the federal level to monitor these animals, to chase them around the countryside. This idea that these animals are just wild and living all confined to wilderness, they're tracked, they're monitored, they're collared. There's huge expenses in managing these programs and managing these animals too. Let's talk about the rules of engagement. Right now, and Terry, you can talk a little bit about this in Colorado. You know, okay, we've had a couple ranches hit up in one part of the state. They're told, well, you can't go out and kill a wolf. You've got to haze it. Or whatever. So how does it vary from each of your states in terms of the rules of engagement? And what should the rules of engagement be for a state like Colorado that's just getting into this? I mean, you know, there's politics involved. You go out and you shoot a wolf pack these days. It's very controversial. You see that in Washington State, see that in California. The removal of problem packs. There's some people who don't even think there is a problem, such a thing as a problem wolf or problem grizzly. We're the problem. People are the problem in the mindset of a lot of the people driving this agenda. So talk about the rules of engagement, anyone who wants to jump in your state, and what, if anything, Colorado could learn from the rules of engagement in other states.
I'll go if you're
Yeah,
ready.
George, jump in.
One of the things that is a big problem in other states is we do not require loss prevention first in order to receive compensation. A lot of the ranchers will not know they even have a problem until it occurs. And to require any rancher to do loss prevention first is a huge expense that ranch may or may not need. And it really puts the rancher at an unfair disadvantage. As far as the rules of engagement in Montana, we have more liberal take. A rancher can shoot a wolf if they feel it's threatening or harassing their livestock. And in our state, USDA Wildlife Services can go in and do full pack removals. I think in some of these other states right now, they're doing we'll remove one, see if it goes on again, remove another one. That does not work, and it's been proven not to work. And I feel some of the people from Montana that Game and Fish has on their committee are not accurately representing what really is happening in Montana. Anyway, as far as the rules of engagement, we shoot them. We're similar to Oregon, other than we don't have that predator zone, but a rancher does have recourse and they don't have to wait.
Okay. Terry, go ahead.
Yeah,
Todd.
and so we do have a caught in the act that is a permitless take here in Oregon. 3/4 of our state is under federal listing now. That 2011, that May 5th, 2011 act that was referred to by George, we're under that in Eastern Oregon. But there we can take a wolf if it's biting, chasing, killing our livestock is the language there. The other 3/4 of the state, the only way you can go to lethal take on a wolf there is if you're threatened personally, self-defense only. And so you can have a wolf pack that's killing cattle, sheep, whatever, every single day, and there's no way to go to lethal take on them under these current rules. And I'm guessing that most of the states are under that. I think there is a 4D rule that is back there somewhere in the Great Lakes that allows a take. But as far as once we reach that threshold here of a wolf pack that has a chronic depredating pack, which is considered two confirmed kills, we see ODF&W go out to many more than the two. And then when they do go to lethal take, we had an instance this year where there was a pack that had been killing a whole bunch of yearlings. And when they went to lethal take, they killed 2 pups. And that was their first take on it. And then they really honestly acted like, we're going to wait and see if that did any good. It was atrocious. I mean, it upset the environmental community, the ranching community, and they should have been embarrassed, but they stood by their decision. They went to incremental take on that pack 3 or 4 different times and never solved the problem. And I wholeheartedly agree that Wildlife Services needs to be the one that goes in there and takes out the whole pack. Science shows that that is the best way to control.
Terry,
In Wyoming,
go ahead, Jim.
yeah, just, in northwestern Wyoming, where they're considered a trophy game animal, it's similar to what we've heard from the other states, except that it's our Game and Fish that does that. Ranchers can take wolves that are harassing or killing livestock. Our Game and Fish issues hunting licenses every year in that area, and they do that in a limited control manner in order to maintain the population number that we've agreed to. That gets some attention, those wolves. In the other 3/4 of the state where the wolf is a predator, as long as they're unlisted federally, it seems that taking wolves just hasn't attracted the public attention, because partly it's maybe assumed it's going to happen, partly because it's done by individuals, some it's done by wildlife services, by any individual that's out there and sees a wolf. So that one has not seemed to be as big of a problem in that sense. I mean, certainly it was used in petitions to relist. That was one of the arguments, that we treat them as predators. But in terms of public engagement, it doesn't seem to have been as big of an issue in that part of the state.
Well, let's talk about the overall politics. One of the things I've noticed in regards to grizzly bears now, it's almost like the roadside grizzlies up near Yellowstone and stuff have become celebrities. These animals are well known. They get a following that's promoted by the media. There's a grizzly up there, 399. She's a kind of urbanized roadside grizzly who's had now 3 cycles of children who then become kind of humanized, acclimated to human environments. And but when you want to go and deal with one of these bears because they're getting too familiar, they're in the city limits, they're rummaging through garbage, they're going into campgrounds, and this is a real problem around Yellowstone and Grand Teton, then all of a sudden everyone's up in arms because you're going after their favorite pet grizzly that they see video of and they read stories about 399. So, a lot of the uproar about this stuff is being driven by urban dwellers and maybe coastal people who see this stuff on the internet, and animals are cute and fuzzy, and doesn't 399 look great when she's walking through Jackson with her cubs? But it raises a real problem in terms of animal management at a time when people are anti-hunting in some cases in urban areas and don't understand wildlife management, have no concept of what's involved, aren't paying the price, or aren't losing their livestock. They're up in arms about this. How do we deal with the larger political problem, which is that some people just don't want to see any animal removed for any reason? Anyone want to jump in on that?
Well, that certainly is true, particularly around Yellowstone and Grand Teton, and there's an economic component. Just this year, we've seen the number tossed out rather regularly that wolves have a $17 million positive economic impact in the state of Wyoming, and that's tourism impact. And I'm certainly not ready to accept that. Certainly tourists who come to the state, come to Yellowstone, Grand Teton, they get pleasure out of seeing a wolf, but I'm not convinced that many tourists come only because of the presence of wolves. It's an addition to the fact that they're there because of the geographic features, because of the open space and all those other factors. But it's something we're having to deal with more and more. And one of my points would be that if it's worth that much in terms of economic return to the state, then some of our tourism dollars should be allocated to pay for wolf depredation and wolf impacts on livestock.
Anybody else want to jump in on that general sort of observation that it's, politically speaking, it's very tough to do active animal management? A lot of people just don't understand.
Yeah, I'll jump in just for a second, because it's not a fairy tale. It's a bit of a nightmare that's being written here. And it's interesting that wildlife advocates now have begun to pick and choose winners and losers in the wildlife community. And they're doing that by ballot measures, state legislation, and the courts. And the wildlife officials at the state and national level are empowered with the tools to balance all wildlife so that we don't continue to see extinction, or we don't see impacts from one species to another that are detrimental. And that's a tough thing to do, but it's really tough to do when you take away tools or you pedestalize one species over the other. And right now, anything that has fangs and claws is very popular to pedestalize. And really what's going to happen long before we see wolves obliterate elk or something along those lines. What we're going to see is we're going to break these game management agencies financially. And we're going to have them paying for things that they don't have the checkbook to be able to do. And that is pedestalizing some of these species. So if you care about, a trophy game species or a trophy species or large ungulates, or you care about, birds, or you care about fish, or you care about salamanders, you've got to let these agencies not only manage their financial resources, but also those species in context of their prey and their habitat. And we're taking that tool away from them. Time and time again, taking it away from them. And I find that to be reprehensible, because if you're a self-proclaimed animal lover, which we all are, we appreciate our animals, both wild and domestic, you have to do what's responsible in general by all animal lives. And we're not seeing that. And somebody needs to call this out very publicly. And I think it's our legislators, our members of Congress, our administrative leadership in states, and say, if you're going to have me spend millions upon millions upon millions of dollars that frankly I may not have in state government on wolf introduction, by the way, wolf introduction, not to preserve the overall population of wolves in the United States at a reasonable level, just because we want them in Colorado, just because, which is a 5-year-old mentality, because I want, then we're going to have, I mean, we're headed down a very dark road, because it's going to be bison next. We want to rewild with bison and let them run free through the cities and counties of Western United States. Where does it end?
Well, I think that's we've got about 10 minutes left. That I think is a huge question, is what's the carrying capacity for apex predators in the modern West? A lot of these animals haven't been seen in places in Wyoming and Montana for a century that they're being seen now. So how do we square that? Last summer, we had a number of fatalities. I don't want to be a sensationalist about it, but the number of conflicts is up. The number of relocations of grizzlies is up and moving. The number of human conflicts and close calls is rising each summer. So the question is, in the modern, populated, heavily recreated West, what is the carrying capacity, and how do we deal with this going forward in a safe way? I don't expect everybody to go out in the woods, won't have a potentially dangerous bear encounter. I don't expect that. But if states can manage them, maybe we can mitigate some of the risks. So overall, what is the future of rewilding in the American West, and will it work? Can it work, and how? That's a big question, but I open it to anybody who wants to jump in.
One thing on that, Sean, I might just say that, Colorado's population, it's a dramatically different state than Wyoming, Idaho, Montana. We've got twice the population of those states combined. And with that population, these conflicts are going to be nothing but exacerbated. And like we've heard from the panelists today, when you throw the regulatory quagmire of the Endangered Species Act on top of this, you take away the ability to manage. So that means conflicts are going to be multiplied even more. So those reasons and others really speak to being thoughtful, deliberate, and careful about how we proceed. Unfortunately, Colorado seems hell-bent for leather on moving quickly, notwithstanding all these issues.
Yeah. Anybody else want to talk in general about where they see rewilding going in the modern American West?
I might take a stab at where we might find equilibrium, and that's at the point where there's an acceptance of loss. And so the conservation community needs to accept that they're going to have loss of predators. The livestock community will accept loss of livestock, and the hunters groups are going to expect loss of their game populations. But you strike the balance at that where you can, in good faith, say that livestock producers can protect their livestock adequately, that hunters can have a huntable population of wildlife, and those predators will remain on the landscape for the conservation group. And I think if you can strike that balance, but we're so far off of that, at least here, it's all about predators, and they get the top priority.
Anybody else?
Well, just one thing that I think makes it challenging with wolves. I mean, most wildlife species, including the grizzly bears, have a certain set of habitat requirements. We're seeing grizzly bears occasionally now wandering out of the suitable habitat, and they don't last there. It doesn't take human factors. There's other factors, and they're gone. But the unique thing somewhat about wolves, and similar to, say, a coyote, is that they're adaptable to such a diverse range of habitats that habitat does not become a constraint on how far the wolves spread out. And we find wolves that travel 50, 75 miles from their normal habitat, and sometimes establish packs that far away. So I think that's the fact that we can't control them based on habitat. We're not going to ever satisfy a big portion of the citizen, the human desire to have these species everywhere. I think it really poses a unique challenge to us. What become the mechanisms for controlling them other than the loss of livestock, the loss of wildlife species that are valued by people and hunted by people, and eventually maybe even some loss of human life? Those are the unfortunate circumstances that are going to have to be reached before there's truly a turnaround in the case of the wolf.
And we haven't even addressed recreational impacts. What's going to happen, in heavily recreated states? A lot of people in the Front Range who voted for this think it'll be cool to be out listening to wolves howl at night. But what about when they take their dogs out and they're attacked by wolves? Or what about if there are closures on public lands because of the risks to public people? So this is a huge topic. I think we've only just touched on it. Real quick round. And I know I'm just throwing this out there, but if you had one piece of advice for Colorado going forward with this, do any of you have some advice to give? George, do you want to try? You've seen how this unfolded all over the West.
Well, seek congressional delisting of wolves. I don't know if your congressman or your senators would be willing to go that route, but which is probably unlikely, I'm guessing, with the political climate in Colorado. But everybody has really touched on really valid topics, and the loss of other wildlife is huge. And if the people in Colorado start seeing that the moose populations, the elk populations are severely declining, maybe that will finally hit home to them. But that may be something that really needs to be publicly put out there, because it's proven in our other states. We have areas where you can't find moose. Moose populations have declined drastically. If you look at Yellowstone Park, there used to be 19,000 elk that came north out of the park, and it was a huge hunting area, hunting season for Montana. Those populations don't exist. And even within Yellowstone Park, if you drive through the park, it's not like it used to be. You used to be able to see elk all over the place. Now you see them in amongst the buildings, and they're amongst those buildings, like at Mammoth, because that's the only safe place they have against the wolves. And also, it's really a good warning for the state of Colorado that we've had wolves travel over 500 miles, and even in the far eastern plains of Montana, out near North Dakota, South Dakota, those wolves are there. They're killing livestock. And so to think that they're just going to stay in the mountains is a misnomer. And it's a very big problem that your state's about to incur.
we've got about a minute left. Anybody else would like to get a last word in here? Again, it's a huge topic, and we covered a lot of ground, but I don't think we even scratched the surface on some of this. So maybe we'll have a follow-on more focused on the wildlife issues, the recreational impacts. There's all kinds of things here.
I would just emphasize the need to build coalitions and to engage in public education. The groups out there who really push this, the ones who bring the litigation all the time, it's a perpetual revenue source for them. They're never going to stop that unless we can educate enough of the public, and even the publics in our own communities, in that we can help dry up the source of some of that revenue.
Well, I hope we've done some of that educating today. We have to sign off. We've been an hour. It goes really fast with this kind of topic. I want to thank each and every one of you for participating today. Like I said, maybe we'll make this a series of discussions and touching on other topics. Mountain States Legal Foundation cares about these issues. We represent some of the people who are impacted on this. Go to our website at mslegal.org to find out about all our work. Aside from endangered species, we do equal protection, gun rights, and a host of things, protecting your constitutional rights. And we've been doing it for 45 years now, and hopefully we'll do it for 45 more. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. It was a great discussion. I hope people come away better educated about these issues. I want to thank our audience, too, for checking in. And stay tuned for future Mountain States of Mind webinars. We'll probably revisit this issue as we go along. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.